Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to line up our keynote speaker. Recognized by Wired magazine as one of the top 25 people who are simply reinventing entertainment and changing the face of Hollywood, I'd like to introduce Lance Weiler, storyteller, entrepreneur, thought leader, and pioneer of mixing storytelling and technology. Ladies and gentlemen, Lance Weiler.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it, and I'm excited. And I was very excited last night when I got a chance to witness your Ignite talk. So you've set the bar very high for me today. So basically, but I don't want to just talk at you. There's going to be one thing that we're going to do first, and this is what I do with all the teams that I ever work with globally, all over the world. You'll notice that there is a little piece of paper on each of your seats, and there's a pencil. Can everybody take a moment and write your name? Just write it small on that piece of paper, please. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do an exercise very quickly that I do with the teams that I work with, that I do with my co-writer. It's called 5 times Why. And what I need you to do is I need you to, everybody to stand up, please. And I need you to find someone that you do not know. Find someone that you do not know. That might be a challenge, but please do. Okay, can I have your attention, please? Is there anybody that does not have a partner? Okay, you guys need to find somebody. Who doesn't have a partner? Raise your hand. Okay, there's two people here. I have no idea if it's an even or an odd number of people. I didn't count everybody. Okay, is everybody paired up? Is everybody paired up? Okay, is there anybody who's not paired up? Okay, does everybody have a partner? Okay, this next part is really important. You need to listen, because this is an active listening exercise. Okay, so what we're going to do is, it's really simple, okay? We have about 7 minutes to accomplish this. You're going to take turns interviewing each other, okay? But there's only one question that you're going to ask, and it's, why did you come here? Okay? And you're going to ask that question 5 times. Okay? You're going to resist the desire to ask a follow-up question, the desire to kind of lead the discussion. You're just going to ask that question 5 times. Okay? So what you're going to do is, when you're interviewing somebody, you're going to write down key insights that that person says on the back of your card. Okay? So as you're listening to them, you would say, why did you come here today? And then you'd listen. It's okay if you shake your head. You listen, that way it won't be totally awkward. You listen and you write down those key insights. And then what you're going to do is then you're going to switch, okay? So once you finish, you're going to switch. So the person who's being interviewed is going to interview the other person. And then when you're done, you're going to write a 2-sentence summary, almost like a tweet, as to why that person is here, okay? But the first step is, you know how you wrote your names on the cards? Trade the cards with each other. Okay, and now, is there anybody that needs any clarification? Is everybody clear on the instructions? You're going to ask the question 5 times. It's on the screens there. Why did you come here today? Pretty simple. I think you should be able to remember that. And go. Okay, you will all be graded on this. No, I'm kidding. So I was wondering, does anybody have any insights about what that felt like? Any comments about that exercise? Anybody in the room? Any thoughts? Yes?
I think what was really is when you to come up with them, it's really a thoughtful process to have to drill down 5 times, and then you just want to ask all these other questions. So it's really nice that way.
So it's something that allows you to drill down, and it's something where even within yourself. Okay. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on that exercise?
I found it limiting only having 5 responses. Because then you have to articulate only 5 things, and so you try to make them more important.
Okay, so you made them more important because you felt limited by the constraint of the 5 questions. Yes, in the back there. Okay, it was energetic. Yes, in the back there. Okay. Found it hard to not ask follow-up questions. The exercise, oh, in the very back there, yes, sir. Okay, to be able to do it more in your everyday work and the value of that, yes. So you use the questions differently. You okay. Did you find the questions in some cases inspiring what you were going to respond when it came around and it was asking you? Did you find yourself building upon that story in any particular way? Yes. Oh, yes, you go ahead.
I thought it was interesting that we both kind of started out with our official role or our official reason for being here, maybe the on-paper reason, but by the end of it, we both came to more sort of emotional or sincere or kind of gut reasons why we were here. So it transitioned over the course of asking myself.
Okay, so it transitioned to something that was more emotional. It reached a more emotional level. And one last one there, yes. Yes, a good way to meet someone new. So now you all have someone new that you've met through this exercise, and you're bonded, hopefully. The goal of it is also this to be an active listening exercise, and it frees you from having to ask any other additional follow-up questions because you already know what you're going to ask. So you can concentrate really on listening to that other person. So thank you for participating in that. But a lot of my talk is really going to be about the value of questions. And in many cases, the question is more valuable than the actual answer. So I have a question that I wanted to share here, and this is something that I am constantly struggling with within my own work, which is how can we harness technology to evoke empathy and emotion while at the same time, sorry, it's a little hard for me to actually, it's my question, I should know. How can we harness technology to evoke empathy and emotion while at the same time enabling an intuitive, invisible, and fluid storytelling experience for the audience? I should know that by heart. But the reason that I think that that's such a powerful question, at least for me in my own work, is I'm constantly trying to figure out how I can make things more human. You know, we are in this digital age, but how can I remember the human interaction? How can I get closer to what that actually means? And so for me, in this particular talk, I'm going to be talking about this idea of building worlds, building story worlds. I'm going to talk about the art, craft, and business of how I actually create the work that I do. And mainly, it's going to center around experiences. So first and foremost, I was traditionally trained as a filmmaker. For the longest time, I called myself a filmmaker, and that defined me. But then I started to realize I wasn't shooting on film as much anymore, I wasn't cutting on film, and I wasn't really exhibiting as much on film anymore. And I wondered why I was defined by that, you know, and I liberated myself from that and started to consider that I was more of a storyteller. And that might seem like a very simple thing, but it was a really important moment for me, because I was locked almost like in this box of a classification of what I had to be, even though the stories and the way that I was telling them was expanding, and I'm going to share that throughout this talk. I thought it was really interesting for me personally when I kind of broke from the shackles of those confines of what it was to be a filmmaker. And what I started to realize was that the story was the same. It was the telling of that story that was changing. And that's where I started to get more and more excited. I wanted to break from, I guess in my particular industry, there was a permission-based culture. And it's constantly at odds with the democratization and the rapid commoditization of various technologies. And I wanted to be able to express myself and tell these stories in ways that I could reach global audiences. And so for me, it really became this idea of this balance between story and technology. And anybody in the room, I mean, a lot of you obviously know the technology side, but for those of you that don't know the story development side, it can be any different than what it is to develop technology. And I often found that the teams that I was working with, the more that code started to intersect and come into my world, the more challenging it was for my collaborators to be able to communicate with each other. That language, the grammar, it wasn't necessarily there. And also what was really challenging was most of the time people would look at technology and they were very literal about what they saw. And they thought that's how it had to be, the way that it was being presented, the way it was represented, and they thought that's what it had to be. And there was also this desire to just immediately follow everything else that somebody else was doing. You know, and it would, I found that it was kind of watering down and kind of creating the situation where it was more about almost like check boxes. It wasn't about the emotional connection to what we were trying to make somebody feel or what we were trying to evoke. So for me, a lot of this is about the emotional core. You know, I'm a storyteller by heart. I've been doing film, television, designing games for 20 years. And if the emotional core isn't there, to me, it doesn't really matter. You know, it's just an execution. It's the moment that you can make somebody feel something that's really powerful. The moment that, and the challenge that I find with digital technology is it's even more challenging to try to make somebody feel something because everything is so fragmented. You know, the experience is so fragmented, and it's so difficult for people to be able to communicate what that experience is. Or, you know, the confines of like, I have to download an app, or I have to get a browser plugin, or why it won't work with this device, or, you know, the constant constraints that I find myself as an audience member fighting up against, whether it be because of DRM technology or whatever it is. So I've been thinking more and more about this idea of the emotional core. And modeling, and a lot of the teams that I work with, we take and we use Joseph Campbell's hero's journey as a way to model and think about how we approach technology and how we think about creating a journey for the audience, a journey for somebody who's stepping in. How can we put them into the shoes of a protagonist? And you're going to see throughout the talk today, there's various examples of that. But I'm really interested in that because it's about agency. How can I give agency to somebody? And what can that look like? So I always love this diagram because it gives you a tracking of various characters through stories, you know, where you have like Lord of the Rings and, Star Wars, 12 Angry Men, which is very linear in progression, and then like if anybody's ever seen Primer, that's the squiggly one down there to the left that's all about like time travel, and they keep meeting each other over and over again. Spoiler alert, sorry. And so what I wanted to do was, I'm going to share a little bit of my own journey, but I'm constantly interested in that because that's like a linear progression, but I'm really interested in the way that you can vertically drop into those different timelines and intersect those different characters. So I started, does anybody know what a Bolex is here? Yes, some people do, yes. There's this thing called film. It used to exist. And you put it in cameras and you could wind the camera and you could shoot for like 30 seconds. It was very, very limiting, very exciting though. So I bought my first Bolex when I guess I was about 14 or 15. I saved up my paper route money and I bought it at a garage sale. And I immediately came home and I started making these films. I was inspired by experimental filmmakers and I loved cinema. And I would process the film in my parents' bathtub against their wishes, and I know why now that I shouldn't have been doing it. But I was telling stories, and I was excited, and I was making this film, and it was this amazing experience for me. But then as I would go, there were so many kind of constraints to that, kind of gathering the people together, sending the film off to get it processed, having the wait, the cost for the film itself. It was just a cumbersome kind of situation, and I had been working commercially. I never went to school. I went to high school. I graduated and I started working in the film industry. I just picked up a phone book that tells you how long ago it was, and I found a production company. I talked my way into it, and I started as an intern, and I would drive film from the sets in Philadelphia to the lab, and I'd sleep in my car, and I'd bring back video dailies, right? And I worked my way up through this journeyman kind of thing, ended up traveling the world, shooting all kinds of things, becoming a director, cameraman, just traveled the world. And one moment, I think, fundamentally changed my life when I was sitting in Penn Station, and I was sitting there, and I was frustrated by the permission-based culture of what it took to make a film, and I wanted to make a feature-length film, and I was sitting there, and I was looking, it was 1996, and there was a card that I could put into my computer that would allow me to edit. It was this fundamental shift for me. And I thought, wow, that's a great reason to get a computer. So a friend and I, we just went off, we read all these books, and we just started building computers. I didn't know anything about computers. I was just like, that's a reason to have a computer. And so with that, we thought, okay, well, let's see if we can make a movie for no money. Let's see if we get, desktop editing, digital cameras were just coming out. Let's see if we can make something for nothing. Because my partner, who I made it with, Stefan Avalos, had been ripped off internationally with his film, and I had failed miserably trying to raise some money for a science fiction film, and raised $30,000 of $250,000 and had to give it back. So we set out to make this movie. It was called The Last Broadcast. And we ended up, we failed in one sense. It cost $900. So we didn't make it for nothing, but it cost $900, friends, family, everybody involved. And it was incredibly liberating because what it did was, because it cost so little, and it came out the year Titanic came out, so that gives you like the scope, right? And so it cost so little that we could have buried it in the backyard, right? And this project represents a moment for me where all of a sudden I started to get creative, not about just the way that I was making the work or the story that I was telling, but also the way I was getting it into the world. And what I did was, with this particular project, what we did was because it was so inexpensive, we started to think, okay, well, how can we actually show it at festivals? And the answer to that question was, $30,000 to $60,000 to transfer it to film, which made no sense. So we were like, okay, well, what's possible? I wonder if we could show it via, I don't know, satellite. And we sat down and we did these schematics and kind of just thought about what it would look like if we delivered it via satellite. And then I literally cold called satellite companies, talked my way up between two major ones, Boeing and Loral Space, and ended up pitting them out against each other and walking away with $2.5 million to R&D what became digital cinema, right? It's what delivers cinema today in theaters. But it was because there was this like naivety, like I was naive. I thought, why not? I can do that. Like if I would have looked at all the things that we achieved with that project and started thinking about it, I would have never done it. It was because we approached it from this almost like childlike sensibility, we were able to actually accomplish it. So that particular project ends up becoming the first all-digital release of a motion picture. I end up starting a video label, end up selling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies of it, sell it into 20 territories all over the world, turn down studio offers for it, and to date it's grossed over $5 million, that little $900 film. But fundamentally, for me, it created a major shift, and I started to think more creatively about, okay, well, it's the whole story. It's a story, it's a journey, it's not just about the destination. So when it came time to make my next work, which was called Head Trauma, I thought I was going to bring in more gaming-based things. And with this particular project, I'm going to focus just on one part of it to give you a sense of a user journey. Because I became more interested in breaking away from the screen. I thought, how can I get away from the screen, and how can I allow somebody to be in the shoes of the protagonist? This particular story centers on a drifter who comes back home after 20 years and finds out that his old residence is condemned and inhabited by squatters, and he decides he's going to try to save it. So he starts to fix it up and he falls and strikes his head. And when he strikes his head, all these reoccurring nightmares start to cross over into his reality. It was built from two moments in my life, one being a horrible car accident, where head-on collision with a garbage truck, where I went through the windshield and lost part of my memory, and it came back to me in my nightmares. And the second, which was as horrifying but not as life-threatening, was I had gone through the pilot process with Fox and gone all the way to the pilot, and then they didn't take the pilot, and I felt like I went through the 5 stages of grief. So combining those two things together, I came out and made something called Head Trauma. Now I'm going to give you the user experience, because what I want to demonstrate here is what it was like. It had a film, it had a site, it had all these traditional things, but where it got interesting for me was when I recontextualized what the movie could be. So imagine it's 2006, 2007, there are still payphones prevalently in major metropolitan areas, and you get off the subway in New York and you're walking, and all of a sudden you're walking down the street and all the payphones up and down the block are ringing, right? So we wrote software that would ring all those payphones. So when you answered the payphone, you would hear this weird fragmented conversation. You weren't really sure what it was, you just hang up the payphone. You walk around the corner, and you can see the gentleman down in the lower left there. He's preaching fire and brimstone. If anybody knows who Jack Chick is, religious propaganda, crazy comics that you would find in truck stops and phone booths. He's handing out these comics. People are like, okay, well, that's weird. And then they end up making their way into the cinema, you know, where we're showing the movie. Now, when they come in, there's a screen. On screen, it says, whatever you do not text, do not call this number, danger, 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 don't do it. And 90-odd% of the audience does. And then once they do, we have them, right? And so they sit down and I say, look, okay, you can leave your phones on. Just leave your phones on. Your phone's going to interact with you. And then the movie starts. And we wrote software that would allow, all of a sudden we start calling all the phones in the room and start connecting people together that don't know each other. We're putting certain things on giving challenges to certain people. And it's a crazy mess, but a collaborative, awesome mess. And then people, you know, like William Castle-esque, you know, some characters coming out, scaring people. It was awesome, and we did this many times. And then afterwards, somebody would go home, and they'd have this comic, and they'd flip it over in the back, and it said, do you want to play a game? And then they would go to a site. And it's like, okay, yeah, that was kind of a weird experience. Sure, I'll go to this head trauma site. All of a sudden, their phone would ring, and when they answered the phone, it would be the nemesis from the movie. And we built this designed to scale. It was all sound designed and everything. And whatever the person said into the phone, it would trigger a state change on the site. So all of a sudden, you would see new video, you would see new audio, and it was happening based upon what you were saying into the phone. And at a certain point, the character would say, tell me something about yourself that nobody knows. So the person would say whatever it was, and then we would loop back over their computer speakers. Of course, that would freak them out, and they would try to exit, right? But we build a fake exit box. So as they're clicking on that, it's delivering a message to the phone that says, where do you think you're going? We're not finished yet, right? And then at that point, it's dropping them into conversations with everybody else that's experiencing the same thing at the same time. Now, what I just described to you goes from what effectively is a communal experience in a cinema to a mobile experience to an online experience back to a communal experience, right? We would take that and end up licensing that technology many times over. So a lot of what I'm fascinated by is this idea of local and global. We're in this connected world, but what does that really truly mean? And how can we make, you know, a lot of the times, a lot of the work that I do, how can I scale it? How can I get more people engaged? So in 2011, I was working on a project that had gone through the Sundance Screenwriting Lab, which was called Hope is Missing, Lord of the Flies kind of story about a strange sleep virus that leaves all the youth to their own devices. Seems like an amazing utopia for them, but they soon learn that it's not everything that it's cracked up to be. So I went to Sundance, and the theme that year for the festival was called Being There. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be interesting if I could do something on the ground in Park City and connect people from all over the world to that action? 40,000 festival goers go there every year. A lot of people are interested in what's happening there. And I thought, I wonder if I can build something that could test that. What would that look like? And so I created Pandemic and 1.0, because it felt like, to me, it was like a software release. I was going to continually iterate on what it was. And I came up with a challenge where I thought, okay, I'm going to build a simulation, a game, that's going to run for 120 hours, that's going to allow people to collaborate to stop the spread of a fictional pandemic. And I'm not just going to play with just that genre story. I'm going to see if I can actually give more purpose to what this story is. And so I ended up collaborating with a group called Medic Mobile, which tracks births and disease using SMS-based technology in third world countries. And I combined efforts with a group called Freedom Lab out of Amsterdam that looks at the future and does future-based reasoning and looks at the future of connected cities. So together we came up with a couple key underpinnings of design to this, like how does morality change in the face of knowledge over time? And if two people have very valuable things, how can they, but don't know each other, how could they potentially find each other? So we built that into the base of what this experience was. So what would happen would be we hid all these golden objects all throughout Park City. They were spray painted gold. They weren't really gold. But we hid them all over Park City. So there were like 50 golden objects just hidden all over Park City. And for anybody who's never been there, it's a mountain town, beautiful. Sundance happens in January. Really gorgeous and a really wonderful festival. So we hid those things there. And we also hid 50 bottles of water. Now, the whole construction of this consisted of a very elaborate thing. And I can stand here today and tell you that I didn't need all these things, but I wanted to test them. I wanted to see what made sense. I wanted to see what worked. So we did things where we had a short film and we had some data visualization, a mobile app that we used to cite. We did secret shows. We had actors out acting that were being manipulated by the story and by the player's agency. And in doing so, what we did too was we built like kind of, I just called it like almost like a contextual storytelling engine, right? And we would look and we'd say like anytime somebody tweeted with a certain hashtag, that would save one person's life. Anytime that somebody found one of the objects, they had different values and it would save that many more people's lives. If somebody found a bottle of water, it would save 100,000 people's lives. And so we built into it these interesting things where we had scripted with 100 tweets each, actors, and they went out into the streets. I had 20 actors and we shot. And the interactions within the game, things being found, people communicating, people searching for pandemics through Google searches, all kinds of things were all factored into the algorithm. And some characters would expend those 100 tweets really rapidly and die, and others would go slowly across the 5 days. Right? So it was like an interesting way to play with this idea that the story had certain predetermined outcomes, but the agency was really within the players and what they were doing and how they were collaborating. So it centered around a short film that was in competition. It told a story about a boy and a girl who are coming to terms with the fact that their mother is sick and they're not sure what to do. Do they stay? Do they run? Do they kill her? It was a very emotional story, and it was in competition, and it day and dated, meaning that it was on YouTube at the same time that it was in living rooms through FearNet, 20 million homes. At the same time, it was on the mobile app for the festival. At the same time, it was in theaters. Now, if you remember, I said that the local global thing was really important to what I wanted to experiment with. So what we ended up doing was we created a site where people could come and just very simply remix assets. Okay? And when they would remix those assets, it would do two important things. It would unlock a phone number, and it would unlock a geolocation of a hidden object in Park City. So this is a sampling of the amazing golden objects that we had, and every object had a story. And when you went through it, you realized that they were connected, and it showed you how the virus had actually spread, where it originated from, and it was this idea of a significant narrative object. So we built out a room, like a Center for Disease Control. So you could walk into that room and it had data visualization that was going on real time from everything that was happening. The room had a 5-act structure. And everything that was happening in that room was based upon the gameplay and what was going on. We had a Surface table, a Microsoft Surface table that was in the center. You could walk in, you could manipulate that, and the whole room would change states. You could go anywhere and you could see what was happening with the story. Now, if you remember, I mentioned the phone numbers. We took, at the time, Nexus S phones, which had just come out, and which were NFC compliant, and we circulated them in 50 biohazard bags, okay, with hand cranks. We just sent them out into the festival without telling anybody anything. Those phones circulated over 5,000 times, connecting about 10,000 people. What would happen would be, like, all of a sudden, somebody would hand you a bag, and you'd be like, well, what is this? And then it'd start ringing. And you'd answer the phone, and somebody on the other end would be so excited that somebody answered the phone. They'd say, I know where the golden objects are. I know where the bottle of water is. You have to find it. We have to find it together. And on average, two strangers, total strangers, would spend about 16 minutes together trying to figure it out, up to half a day, okay? Working collaboratively to try to find these things. Now, the person who wasn't there became the eyes on the ground for them and led them through Park City and was mapping and helping them get all over the place. And they would go and they would try to find these hidden things. Now, when they would make their way back, because the person on the other line would say, you know what, you need to go back to that mission control space, or you need to go to this mission control space. They'd walk in and they'd set the phone on the surface, and it would bring up anything the phone had done. Okay? And then in addition to that, if they brought back one of the objects and they set it down on the surface, the whole room would change state. So down there's an example of where somebody's putting a bottle of water on the surface, and the room is saying, congratulations, you just saved 100,000 lives, and that's pushing it out to everybody who's playing, okay? So over the course of that particular experience, we had about 250,000 players over the course of those 5 days, and as I said, those phones turned and connected, turned 5,000 times, connected about 10,000 people, and it was a really interesting experiment in terms of local and global. So the other side of what I've been doing across the work is really trying to figure out, and I'm always thinking about these four things, like how can I make it social? How can I make somebody feel connected to what's going on within the story? How can it be personalized in some way? And how can it be pervasive? Last year I collaborated with David Cronenberg and TIFF and the CFC. They had seen my work and they wanted me to come and create a connective tissue around a retrospective of David's work, and also around this traveling exhibition that's going to travel for like 4 years. So it's really funny, I should show you the slide that they gave me. They had this amazing like brief of everything that was going on, and they got to the part I was, and it was like one slide, and it said, alternate reality game. And that was it. And I was like, okay, that's cool, we'll figure it out. And so I came up with this crazy idea where I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna try to create an experience that allows somebody to step into David's world. Now, David is an iconic filmmaker. You know, movies like Videodrome, Scanners, the remake of The Fly, most recently Eastern Promises, Map of the Stars, which just recently came out. And David's been making films for like over 40 years. So, so I came up with this concept, and I thought, wow, you know, David's work is kind of interesting in terms of he's very true to what he does, and his films have really, they ask really interesting questions. What if David's science and technology within the fictional IP within his movies, what if that was actually licensed to a biotech startup and used as a way to create a next gen of human implants to evolve humanity? What if? Like, if you know David Cronenberg, you know that that's right in the sweet spot of what David's work, some of his work is about. And so I gave it to David, and he loved it, and he said, this is really great, can I act in it? And I said, of course, that would be wonderful. And so we ended up making this 3-part simulation that would allow somebody to come in and help to educate an artificial intelligence that would go into this first embeddable implant that would evolve humanity. And the first one was called POD, which stood for Personal On Demand. So kind of like Amazon or Netflix and a recommendation engine. Imagine if you had one that embedded in the back of your neck, and it knew everything you want, needed, or desired before you did, right? And so what participants did was they went through a 3-stage simulation. It was based on emotional intelligence. And the first stage was about trust and disgust. The second stage was about fear and anger. And the last stage was about joy and sadness. And the players stepped into this, and it had about 45 minutes worth of filmed content within it. It consisted of a lot of different questions, and the AI was kind of presenting itself to you. You were interacting with it. I was literally blown away by the response that we got. We got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of responses from people that were incredibly heartfelt in terms of how they were interacting with this fictional landscape. And what was fascinating about that was, I think the key element of this particular project was we left gaps in the narrative. I think a lot of the times digital work is so much about the tell that it forgets to show, right? And it also is so overly tell that it leaves out any opportunity for imagination or room for somebody to place themselves within that experience. And so with Pod, what would happen, and I know that this room will appreciate this, is that when you started playing this experience, in order to get your own pod, you had to complete all 3 simulations. When you started, you were kind of weighted on a number of different factors, and we collected data all the way through the experience. Like, how much did you watch? What did you end up clicking on? What were how did we weight the responses that you gave? And in the gallery space, the museum space, a 3D printer would fire up and would start printing a pod that was customized to the player based upon their responses in the game. So they were creating a significant narrative object based upon their interaction, their play, right? Because they challenged me and they said, okay, there are 2 core business objectives here. We want to drive people to, I think what was it, crowd and buzz last night was the 2 things that were mentioned in terms of like focus. It wasn't dissimilar to what they challenged me with. And so we want to drive people to the exhibition, and we want to connect people who aren't there and let them be able to interact. And we want to find some way that we could transact on this beyond the ticket price. So those printers would fire up, and they started printing pods for different people. And then we had a really awesome lab, environment with people who were working in the lab. It was built within the museum space that we were in, which was the TIFF Lightbox in Toronto. And as they would go, people were able to actually interact with Pod, and they were able to see their pod gestating. Now, what's interesting is when we finished this for the pod implantation, people flew in from all over the world to come and claim their pod, which was a 3D printed physical object that had some connection to them. So in that particular instance, that was like that idea of personalization, connecting, how was it pervasive, all the things, and how was it social. So the next example, I don't think could be any different than what I just described. In fact, like the 2 things that I've shown you are very genre-based. This next one is inspired by my son, and this idea of those formerly known as the audience. Now, my son is 6 years old, and he loves Minecraft. Has anybody in the room played Minecraft? It's okay, you can admit if you have. He's 6 years old, and he loves Minecraft. And so one day he comes to me and he says, Dad, what's screen capture software? And I say, well, here, let me show you. And I'm like, why do you want it? And he's like, well, I watch these videos from Stampy Cat, these Let's Play videos. And Stampy Cat, for anybody who doesn't know, is like a 23-year-old guy from the UK, and he creates these characters, and he puts them in the sandbox game, which is, Minecraft, and he tells stories like in 20 minutes and shows you how to build things. And so my son loves that. All his friends love that. And so my son said, I want to create my own Let's Play videos. So I sit him down, and if you remember when I was talking about my Bolex, right, and the steps that it took for me to create something, I sit my son down, bam, he starts recording, he's got the format, he's running with it, and to date he's created 10 episodes that are Let's Play videos. In addition to that, he's reduced the amount of time that he's watching television, right? So he's not watching Sprout as much or Nick Jr., and he's creating his own stuff. So I wonder, those formerly known as the audience, they're now collaborators, they're now storytellers. It's classic, it's not just a broadcast thing, even though I'm talking at you. It's that idea of a 2-way communication. And so this next project kind of embodies, and what I love about being a dad is it's at times it's difficult because it's a lot of questions, but I also love those questions, and I love that childlike sensibility, and I love that ability to think outside a box, or not even know that a box exists. And so this is Laika, okay? Laika is a little robot from another planet. Her planet's is withering away due to the misuse of her fellow robots, and she, of course, has the largest heart on the planet, and she's sent on this hero's journey. It's kind of a reluctant hero to try to save her home. And so what she does is she comes to Earth in order to do that. There's a number of design techniques that I've relayed in the previous two examples that are at play here, but there's a major simplification in the way that this particular one works. So Leica's adventure basically has Leica traveling all over the world, and to date she's gone over 34,000 miles. She's encountered over 1,500 students and 65 different cities, and it's all around one connected toy, right? So in the guts of Leica, she has a variety of sensor technology, okay? So she's able to read air quality, altitude, geolocation, air temperature, and she's able to push that back towards the students. We've been developing this project and working on it for about 3 years. We've rapidly prototyped it. We've put it into the hands of children as much as we possibly can, and we've designed with and for those children, okay? So we run these really amazing labs. So you know, you'll come to the lab and the kids will go outside and there'll be a rope and a balloon like up in the air, and there'll be a box dangling from the balloon, and they'll lower the balloon down, they'll lower it down, and then they'll realize that they want to open the box, but in order to open the box they need to collaborate with each other. And then when they collaborate, they open it and Leica's inside, right? And there's certain things that have come from some of the other students in other parts of the world, and the kids work for about an hour to an hour and a half or longer around some STEAM-based initiatives: science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And most importantly, they collaborate together, and it's about 21st century skills, right? So Leica travels based upon where they would like her to go. We went to Australia. This is her in the Great Barrier Reef, snorkeling. This is her making some friends with sea turtles in the Great Barrier Reef. This is exciting too, because we did a test, because at the culmination of this particular project, Leica will return to space, but I'll get to that in a moment. This is a dry run with the University of Maryland, where the students built a rig that sent Leica up 90,000 feet to the edge of the atmosphere. The balloons burst, you know, so it took an hour and a half to climb to that height. The balloons burst, and then she came down in like 30 minutes. It took us about 3.5 hours to find her in a cow pasture, right? So what's amazing about this particular project is it places children directly as a companion for Leica in helping her, because what she collects on her here on Earth is going to help save her home. And so she needs to get back home. And so with the children and in different places that we go, like schools, museums, hint, hint, if you want Leica to come, you know, you can find weloveleica.com. We'd love to come to your museum. And in addition to that, at the end of the project, all the artwork and the stories and everything will be launched into space by NASA. So when kids look up at the night sky, they can be reminded of how far their imaginations can carry them. So this particular project is all about this idea of how far your imagination can carry you, and how story can be a part of what that journey is, and how you can kind of, you know, it's endless possibilities. And I think it's that naive, childlike sensibility that I try to bring to the work that I create. So I have one that is about finding and telling stories with data. This particular project kind of came out of my work at Columbia University. I teach at Columbia University, and I'm a founding member of the Digital Storytelling Lab there. It's really funny because, you know, when I said at the beginning, I said, you know, that I never went to school. One of the things that I left out of what I just talked about, like, is one of the main reasons I did that project is I'm dyslexic, right? And the way that I learn is different. And I was held back. I was almost held back in school, but it was because of my mother spending time with me over the summers that I wasn't. And so what's interesting is that my mom, I've done all these crazy things, but the thing that made my mom most excited was when all of a sudden I started teaching at Columbia University. Like all the other stuff, Wired magazine, all that stuff didn't matter at all. It was the fact that her son was actually teaching at Columbia University. So this project comes out of Columbia, and it comes out of this idea of designing with and for. I had heard about aging out of foster care from a group called Orange Duffel Bag, and I was just amazed at the realities of what that world is like. I had no idea. It sounded like a science fiction story to me. You know, your ID changes, you're in multiple households. It almost felt like they were second-class citizens, and then by the time you're 18 in most states, or by the time you're 21, you're pushed out of the system, and 70% of those kids, the 30,000 that are aging out every year, end up incarcerated, on the streets, homeless, almost pregnant, addicted to drugs, and I was just blown away by the stats, and I was blown away by the reality of this. And so with the students that I have, we gathered with some foster youth, and we created a science fiction experience that was part immersive storytelling, involved sensor technology, and basically the idea was that somebody would be able to go through this experience and come out on the other side and understand that everything that they felt emotionally is what kids feel every day when they age out of care, right? And so we took a story between Lydia, she's on the left, and her cousin Kathy. They were both put into foster care early on. And so what ended up happening was Lydia met a drama teacher in junior high. It changed her life. Her cousin Kathy was not so fortunate. She was murdered by the time she was 18 and left in a shallow bed of pine needles on Christmas Eve. But the stories of them were very different, light and dark. And so within this experience, the students that I had and also the foster youth put together this really compelling and interesting project called My Sky is Falling. Now, My Sky is Falling, there's a whole white paper about it. We came up with 26 different ways to measure feedback within this experience. I worked with a group called the Harmony Institute. And effectively what somebody would do is they would come through this experience, and we charted this out, and this is all in the white paper, but you could come through and you would come through as a role. You would have a certain role that you would take on. You would move through the story. You would be able to kind of interact with other characters that were in the experience, and at the same time, you would be wearing a sensor on your wrist that came from MIT that would track your emotions, right? So when you would go through the experience, we were able to measure your emotions within the experience. The blue being times where people were less engaged, and the red being times where they were fully engaged. It was incredibly interesting to look at people who came into this experience who had no interest in social causes at all, but found themselves incredibly compelled in actually donating on the other side of it, because we were able to really kind of look and see how people were engaging throughout the experience. So it was an opportunity to really kind of use data as a tool within that storytelling. Like I said, you can find the white paper. It goes into great detail at myskyisfalling.com. So I guess the big thing for me is this idea that creativity kind of rests at the edge of failure. It was said at the top of the day in terms of taking little bets, learning from them, continuing forward. So a lot of what I work to do in my work is I'm always trying to get to that edge. I'm always trying to try something different, try something new within what I'm doing. And the last project that I'm going to share is called it's about this idea of story-driven innovation, and it's a project that we are doing at Columbia in conjunction with Lincoln Center and the New York Film Festival and the Brown Institute for Media Innovation. And it's called Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things. So it's this idea of being able to retell or reimagine what Sherlock Holmes is like, but by doing it through inanimate objects. So it runs for 12 months. We have no idea exactly what's going to happen at the end of the 12 months, except for the fact that we have to premiere something at Lincoln Center. It's a collaborative effort that works with a whole group of people globally, and we work together because the reason that we're using Doyle's story, his 56 short stories and 4 novels, is that when his stories came out and were being serialized, he was writing about fingerprints and blood stains. He was writing about not contaminating crime scenes. And investigators at the time were reading that and saying, wow, that's a really good idea. And that gave birth to forensics. So we're looking and we're saying, how can story be an innovation driver? How can it lead to new goods, products, services? But also, how can we experiment with this project, which is in the public domain, as a way to challenge how authorship works, how intellectual property works, and how can we use this project as a way to explore digital literacy and the implications of the rapidly approaching Internet of Things. So if you're interested, you can find it at sherlock.digitalstorytellinglab.com. These are 10 things that I wanted to kind of leave you with that are things that I have been kind of working with. Some are obvious, but I feel that these are always things that I try to bring into design. You know, I have to be willing to let go. I have to, let go of what I'm creating and be willing to take these little bets. And there's a wonderful book by Peter Sims called Little Bets. It's about through a series of little bets you can have a big breakthrough. It's all about prototyping. The audience is a hive mind. They're always faster. They're always smarter. And you need to respect them. Be clear and transparent about what you're trying to do and communicate that. You want to keep it simple. That's some of the hardest stuff. But I think you could see, I'm working towards that. I'm working towards simplicity. It's hard when the infrastructure is so fragmented. You want to leave mystery, those calculated gaps that I talked about. You want to leave room for the imaginations of the people that you're trying to interact with. You want to make the tech transparent and invisible. That's something I still have not been able to do, but I try to do all the time. You want to experiment and fail quickly, and you want to make sure that it's fun, right? You want to remember to make it fun. And I think the last one on here is like, if somebody can't explain what it is to somebody else easily, it's going to die a slow and miserable death, right? So I think that that's really important. So these are some resources just really quickly. I'll jump through. I wrote a book on Twitter, 140 copies. It only exists in 140 copies. It consists of 140 tweets. It was an experiment in scarcity and abundance. The best part was I gave 30 minutes to whoever bought the book, and I've had amazing conversations with people all over the world, people who are doing illness narratives to people who are working and using storytelling in really cool ways. Very simple execution, very simple way to do it. It was fun. Digital Storytelling Lab, if you want to check that out, we put all kinds of resources online, all free and open to everybody. We're doing this really cool thing called /story, where we gather 20 storytellers over 3 days to tackle 5 impossible problems. We're doing it in Costa Rica, and we encourage storytellers of any kind. We did our first one in May, and it was incredibly successful. So that's called /story. And I just want to say thank you for your time.